Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to disaster recovery, business continuity, resilience, COVID, anything that can be relatable to those topics. Speaking of topics, if there is something you'd like us to talk about on the show, please feel free, reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there, so I'm really easy to find. Send me a message and we'll see about getting you on the show or finding someone to come on the show and talk about the topic you want us to touch on. I also want to announce I will be speaking at the Continuity Insights Conference in Minneapolis on October 4th to 6th this year. Hopefully I can be on site for that. And also I will be speaking at the Continuity and Resilience Today Conference, or CRT, in Toronto, December 1st to 2nd. And again, hopefully that'll be on site. Now, I said that if you had something you wanted to talk about, reach out and find me through LinkedIn. Today's guest did exactly that. So I want to welcome to the show the COO of, and I want to make sure I get it right, Tempest Risk Management, Andrew Ziegler. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks a lot, Alex. I appreciate it. And yeah, I was pleasantly surprised you responded back on LinkedIn and we turned it right around and now here we are getting together.
Well, I tell everyone, reach me that way, and I do respond to everything. So there we go. You are proof that I actually follow through on what I say. Now, just in case, I'm sure some people listening might know who you are, but we've got people around the globe. Can you take a minute or two and tell us about yourself, what you do, and how you got into this business continuity risk area?
Sure. So I probably spent the last 25 years or so working for a couple of major financial institutions, started all the way at the bottom, taking telesales calls on the phone, and eventually worked my way up into operations, most of that time being in digital banking, digital operations. And a major component of that eventually evolved into production support, disaster planning, a lot of IT disaster recovery work. As far as anything from dealing with individual customer problems to messaging that we would have to put up that millions of customers would see on our website and some of our digital properties as part of that communication protocol. So when looking back on my career, I just really, really enjoyed that aspect. I really dug it. I felt like I was pretty good at it. So that sort of evolved into some freelancing work a couple of years ago, some consultant work on business continuity. And I decided to launch my own company, Tempest Risk Management, in 2020, January of 2020. Perfect timing for COVID to hit. Yeah, I know. Perfect timing. And yeah, we've seen some success since then and making a lot of inroads and meeting a lot of great people in the industry and certainly learning a lot. So, that's pretty much my primary focus right now is business continuity planning. I mainly work with small and mid-sized businesses. So that's really an underserved market is kind of what I found. So I really like working with the individual small business owners who have had no exposure to the formal process of business continuity, resiliency planning, and most of them come away with sort of a new appreciation of sort of all those benefits. Alongside of that, also, besides my professional experience, I've also been a volunteer fire rescue operator for 18 years. So I have a lot of experience doing that. And I think that ties into what our topic is going to be today.
Yes, actually, what Andrew did is he reached out with a suggestion of talking about a couple of articles he posted on his website. And one of them I thought was rather interesting. And you just hinted at it. 4 things you can learn from firefighters. And I think that's, as soon as I read the title, I didn't even have to read the article. And I knew, gotta talk about that one. That sounds really good. So let's go through these 4 items. And we'll start with number 1, which you think would be kind of logical, even just saying it. But I know you've got a lot more to say about it. Call 911.
Yeah, so call 911, all right? Speak up. If you see something, say something. It's all sort of variations on the same theme, on the same topic. So how many times, have we had Even somebody, say, like an entry level worker who sees something wrong and they just kind of sit back and hope that it either fixes itself or doesn't say anything or tries to fix the problem themselves without actually saying anything, actually speaking up. And before you know it, there's more and more damage being done because they didn't say something. And a lot of times because they didn't even know that there were some other impacts happening because of whatever that situation might be. So for organizations and businesses, what I would encourage them to do is make sure that your employees know that they feel comfortable reporting issues, that they know where to go. And usually that's, to probably their first level manager, or for, depending on the industry or company you're in, you may have a safety officer or even a helpline that you have to call into, in order to report an issue. But make sure that they know, don't hesitate, don't wait. Go ahead and report that issue. You're not going to be punished if it turns out to be a false alarm. We certainly don't punish, Mr. Smith down the street who thought he smelled smoke. And we go, about 75% of the fire calls that we get wind up being false alarms. Could be an odor of a smoke, or I think I smell gas. And we show up and people apologize. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't think I was going to call 911. Well, you know what? 25% of the time, it is an actual emergency. And if they didn't call us in time, there could have been a greater disaster or a bigger problem that could have happened. So make sure that your employees know, to call in the help that they need, to report the issues, where they need to go, because even if it is a false alarm, what's the worst you're going to do? Waste a few minutes of time, but imagine how much damage you can prevent by having some sort of early detection. So we always, just like we encourage the public to always call 911, or if you see something, say something, we need to do the same thing with our employees too.
Obviously, 911, when we think of that, we're thinking of calling the police, fire trucks, ambulances, those kind of things. Internally, if we see something, to our organization inside, not just things outside, is there anything you recommend organizations should have, either a help desk or a service desk or something like that, or security on site, reception, any suggestions along those lines, in case they find something internally?
Sure. Well, it really depends, on the organization and on the size of the organization. For, let's say, a small business which only has a few employees, maybe it's just going right to the COO or the president saying, just call me directly if you have any issues. If it's a large organization, then you're right. It may be facilities or security in which you would want to call. But, it also depends on the nature of the incident. If we're talking a cyber attack, well, calling the, security desk or the front security desk may not be the right place to go to. Versus if, let's say, somebody's having a seizure, on the floor of a call center, well, then security may be where you want to go to. So companies probably really should consider that. One of the values and benefits of having a system like 911 is, think about the 911 operator. They get the call, and it could be of any number of types of emergencies, but they know where to route that call. Is this fire, EMS, or police? So in that respect, you may want to consider having a central source that everybody can go to report an incident, but make sure that that source, let's say it's a help desk, for example, knows where to route that call. Do I need to send it to facilities, IT, or, operational management? Because this could be anything from a suspected cyber attack to, like I said, somebody having a medical problem, on the floor. Or what if it's a case of sexual harassment or some sort of abuse? Companies should really think about that and consider, do they want to have...
That's an interesting point. Before I lose that thought, what if someone does see something like that? Is that a 911 call? Something along those lines, sexual harassment or anything along those lines. What would be your recommendation there? That might not be a 911 call where you need fire and ambulance, et cetera, and people, well, for the most part, don't want to get involved in something like that.
Well, sure. So let's go down that. Let's pull that thread a little bit. So in the case of some sort of harassment or abuse or a threatening environment, I think it should be treated as a 911 call. And here's the reason why. Think about how the employees are going to feel about that, right? Think about how, if you were an employee and you were feeling in that way, wouldn't you want it to be treated as an emergency? What if there's a threatening environment that's happening right then? Well, then I think it's a responsibility of the company to be aware of it as soon as possible and take immediate action. We also have to think about how this could be responded to or viewed, not only from a regulatory point of view, but what about a liability issue as well? For that matter, what about the public? What about public perception? What if this employee felt harassed, they reported to their manager and nothing was done for a week, and then they went to the local newspaper and told their story, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that the companies absolutely should consider. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want them going to the security at the front desk or reception to report a sexual harassment issue, but give them a vehicle, right? And so it's probably HR, right? It's probably going to be an HR person, or maybe it's right to the CEO if you're a smaller company. Make sure that employees know where they can go to report all different kinds of issues, even if it's like threatening environment or a sexual harassment issue. And yes, in that case, I would absolutely treat it as an emergency. Now, I think you're going to want to think about what those protocols are in place, and there are experts in HR that are much more versed than I am at what type of response to take. But I do think that response needs to be immediate, because it's the right thing to do. And think about all the other perceptions and liability you may be opening yourself up to if you don't treat it as an emergency.
Yeah, it's good, because a lot of people, as I say, think 911, and even I do. There, you see a fire or a crime occurring, mm-hmm. but anything less than that, I think a lot of people don't consider it, quote unquote, a 911 emergency.
Right. So I think it's much better to err on the side of caution, and report the issue, and then let the folks who are trained and versed and responsible for making a response decide whether it's actually an emergency or not. And like I said before, in the fire service, 75% of our calls wind up being false alarms. But the ones that we'd rather err on the side of caution. This is what we tell the public. Call if you have any concerns at all. Call. Let us come out and check out the situation and see if there actually is an incident or not. Because the last thing we want to do is for somebody to not call or be embarrassed, and now all of a sudden, there actually was a problem and a lot more damage is done before we have a chance to come in and mitigate that damage. Same thing can be related to a company. Empower your employees. Encourage them to speak up. If they see something that doesn't seem right.
Good point. Yeah. All it takes is one time to ignore something and mm-hmm. find out later on. Can you imagine how somebody would feel, how I would feel if I didn't pick up the phone and call 911 when I saw something and find out the worst, shall mm-hmm. we say, occurred? My God, I'd much rather get told it turned out to be nothing, but thanks for calling, rather than thanks, you didn't call, you knew, and look what happened.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
So the second thing we can learn from firefighters is respond fast.
So I mentioned the article, and I like this. I said Hollywood exaggerates a lot of things, but firefighting and response times isn't one of them. So what about that is correct? What do they usually get right? Well, what you see in the movies and on the TV shows is absolutely right. When that call comes in or that hotline rings or the siren blows, we actually still have an old school siren on the top of our station. You don't see that a lot anymore. But we drop everything we have. And usually within about 30 seconds of the call coming in, we have our gear on, we're on the trucks, and the trucks are pulling out of the station. We're actually measured on it. That's one of the KPIs of a fire department, because they track everything on the radios, is what time did the call come in, and then what time did you go on radio saying that this engine or that engine or this crew was responding. And the average time is about 30 seconds being able to get out the door. So the key part of that, and again, this is what you see in Hollywood and how it relates to business, is number one, we have people ready to go. We have the staff on site. We have people that are trained and able to respond quickly to an incident. The other thing is that we have, we are prepared to drop everything in order to respond to that incident. I'll tell you, I think it only happened once, but we do have a locker room. And I remember one time I was in the shower, in the middle of a shower, when the siren blew. Now, I'm not going to get into trouble if I finish taking my shower and I miss the truck, but this is probably early in my career. I'm really excited about every time an emergency comes in. So yeah, I ran out of the shower, dried off in probably about 10 seconds, threw on my clothes, put on my gear, and managed to jump on the truck right as it was pulling out of the station. Now, I'm not saying that, a company's response needs to be that serious, but the lesson that we take from that is, really be ready to respond, making sure that you have people that are ready to respond. If you have an emergency response team, and I'll probably just reference that, a number of times throughout this discussion. So your ERT, or your emergency response team, they need to prepare to respond like first responders. This is the first response of your company. Wherever the call is coming in your detection, kind of think of them as the 911 operators. That might be a manager. It might be a security help desk. It might be the IT help desk, or could be HR, right? In the case of what we were talking about before. But when they bring in the first responders, the team that needs to respond, they need to be ready to drop everything. And they need to be empowered and enabled to do that. So their bosses and their employees need to know, hey, if an emergency comes up, I'm going to need to drop off this call, off this conference call, leave this meeting, step aside from this conference, whatever the case may be, in order to respond to that emergency. Because the longer we wait, the more damage that could potentially be done before we have a chance to respond and mitigate the damage.
Well, that leads to one of the points that you also had in your article with regards to respond faster, and that's analysis by paralysis. Mm-hmm. So what did you mean by that?
So I like these little terms, right? And one of them is analysis paralysis. So think about, so in the fire service, when a call comes in, do you think we're standing around thinking, hey, what truck are we supposed to take? Well, who's supposed to go on this call? Who's supposed to go there? When we show up at the scene, there's no discussion about who's going to grab the hose or who's going to grab what tool and go to perform what function. This has all already been discussed and decided ahead of time. So everybody knows what their job is before we actually go into the fire. That doesn't mean that we know what we're going to be rolling up to. We're prepared for whatever the situation might be, but we're not standing around spending a whole lot of time debating all of the pros and cons of what one response might be versus another. A lot of times, any action is better than no action. And that's kind of the point of the analysis paralysis, is you don't want to be stuck debating what the pros and cons are of an action, whether you should pull that trigger or push that button or not. You want to make decisions quickly. So in the case of, a business or an emergency response team, they should know what triggers they can pull, what buttons they can push as far as a mitigation or response plan. But they really shouldn't get stuck in debating the pros and cons and make a decision quickly. You can always pull back on it if you need to, or adjust on the fly as you go. But the worst thing that you can do is to be stuck in that debate. The time for analysis paralysis is before that emergency. The time for debate is before that emergency even happened. And if you didn't take the time to do that, then I would say that you don't have a very effective or established business continuity program at that point.
And we all know decisions get made very quickly in business all the time. So. Mm-hmm. Sarcasm there for sure. But during a time of disaster, the time you've got to respond goes down and the demand for information goes up. So if you are stuck with analysis by paralysis, waiting for all your information, to your point, more damage is getting done while you're sitting there trying to decide what your first move is, right, let alone anything afterwards.
Right. Yeah. You can't wait. You can't make the time. You can't wait for the time to make that perfect decision, because if you wait too long, that no decision you make is going to be a right one, because you've already waited too long. The damage is already done.
And it'll actually be harder to make the decisions you need as well, because now you've got more things to deal with.
Yes, it's become exponentially, potentially more complicated because of other downstream impacts that may have happened because of the fact that you waited. You can't predict the future, so you shouldn't make your decisions based on that.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. We are talking with Andrew Ziegler, COO of Tempest Risk Management. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Today we are talking with Andrew Ziegler, COO of Tempest Risk Management, and we're talking about his article, 4 Things You Can Learn from Firefighters. Andrew, great first segment. We talked about call 911, respond fast. Now, number 3 is know your tools and when and how to use them. What do you mean by that?
So in the fire service, clearly we have a lot of different tools, a lot of equipment. You have the fire hose, right? You have axes, we have stalls, but we also have a lot of medical equipment. EMS, a big part of our response in fire rescue is EMS assist, right? So we have to know how to use AEDs or collars, so right, like neck collars in case people are in accidents, things like that. So there's a whole lot of tools. But there's a lot of them that we don't use all of the time. So an AED, for example, I've had to use an AED. I've been doing this for 18 years. I've only actually used an AED on a patient once. But
can you just quickly explain what an AED is for anyone? Because of global listeners, maybe not everyone's familiar with the acronym.
I'm sorry, it's an automatic defibrillator. So when somebody has a cardiac event, like a heart attack, this is where you slap the pads on and then the machine says clear and it shocks people, right? In order to bring them back, you're trying to get a good rhythm back in the heart. So it's a tool, that we have on all of our trucks and all of our engines. But I've only actually had to use it once. Now, we're trained on how to use them all the time. And we actually have to go through training and be certified how to use them, to make sure that we, to basically make sure that when the time comes, we can actually use them properly. So knowing all of our tools and all the tools that are on the truck and every one of the engines, you actually can't even ride any one of the engines until you have demonstrated that you know how to properly use every one of the tools on there. Because some of the tools, if you don't use them right, you can actually cause a lot of damage. You can, cause injury you can damage somebody's property. You can cause injury to a person or yourself if you don't actually know how to use it properly. So our tools are obviously a big part of the fire service, and that relates to business obviously as well. So, if you have tools in your organization that are used for business continuity, some sort of emergency response, make sure that, that you know how to use them. And so this is part of the training. And that's actually point number 4, which we'll get to in a minute, where we talk about training. But knowing how to use those tools is actually a very important part as well.
Now, you've talked about the tools on the fire truck that firemen have to know, which is interesting because I really thought it was different people on the truck had different areas of responsibility, but really they have to be able to switch all the time and know how to use everything.
Yep.
So how do you care, if you'd like to comment on that, and then also what kind of tools should an organization have?
Sure. So in the fire service, yes, you have to know how to use pretty much everything on the truck. Now, everybody has different specialties, though. There may be some things that you're more familiar with. Somebody with more medical training obviously would pick up something, a medical assist. They would probably do more or take control or take the lead. But actually what it is, it's actually based on where you're sitting on the truck. You actually have a specific assignment. So, for example, on our engines, if you're sitting behind the driver, what they call the driver's side jump seat, your job is to grab the thermal imaging camera and a fire extinguisher. The officer jump seat, right, who actually sits behind the officer's seat, which is on the left side of the truck if you're looking at the front of it, their job is actually to grab, a different set of tools, usually what they call the irons. So they're actually grabbing, an axe and what they call a Halligan bar, which is another tool. So everybody on the truck, and it doesn't matter it doesn't matter who you are. What matters is where you're sitting and what position you're in. And that's where the pre-assignments can come in. How does that relate to business? I think that depends on the job assignment. So in your emergency response team, you should have a predefined set of protocols. And in your business continuity plan, basically this person, let's say your facilities manager, okay, they're responsible for securing power. They're responsible for, let's say, safety and evacuation. And then maybe your HR person, who may be a member of your emergency response team. They're in charge of employee communication. And here's how we execute that employee communication. Maybe you have a program like Rave or Everbridge that allows you to send out mass text messages or emails. Or maybe you're a small company and you just have a text message list or an email list. Well, it's that person, it's that position. They have that responsibility. That should be predefined. It makes that emergency response go a lot smoother when you're not having to, again, waste time debating on who is going to do what, because that's already been sort of determined beforehand.
It's interesting that how do you, well, I can't get away without moving into the next piece here. So
yeah, they are tied together.
Yeah, because this one does flow, just perfectly into the last point that you have, and that's plan, train, and repeat. So my question was going to be, how do you become familiar with these tools? I couldn't ask that question without going into number 4 here. Right.
Well, I think that kind of, yeah, you're right. So it's all about the training. It's about preparing. But, when I've been through a lot of different training sessions, read lots of articles, about training, right? Anything from tabletop exercises and disaster scenarios and things like that. And, that's all well and good. And when we talk about, there's also some tool usage depending on what you're going to do. Let's say you're testing out your mass notification system. Well, you're actually going in and using that tool. You're training on that tool, actually how to use it. We talk about an ITDR exercise, disaster recovery exercise. So this is where you're actually potentially failing your production environment and restoring it from backup in order to make sure that it works. And there's usually a lot of tools involved with that. That tool may just be a procedure that you have written out about the different steps that you need to follow. But chances are there's going to be some technology involved as well in order to execute communications or an IT or power restoration or utility outage, things like that. So knowing what the tools are, again, this all comes back to business continuity planning. It's having them documented in your plan, making sure that the people who need to know how to use them are trained on how to use them. And that doesn't mean just reading the instructions or going through the training class. It means actually using them, actually executing on them, clicking those buttons, starting that generator, that emergency generator every once in a while. Make sure that you're very familiar. And since we're going into that plan, train, repeat, you're making sure that more than one person knows how to do it as well. We can talk about succession planning, and part of that means that you always need to make sure that you're at least 2 deep, not only on leadership, but knowledge for that leadership as well. So always have at least 2 people who are trained on how to use that tool and have intimate knowledge, because what if a part of that disaster or that business disruption that you have also meant that one of your primary people that you depend on to use those tools are unavailable or displaced, or they might be dealing with another emergency. So it's also about that's, again, bring this back to the firefighting, right? Making sure that you know how to use every tool that's on the truck. But you do have some people that are more familiar and they specialize in some of those tools more than others. But if you had to, yes, on the fire service, pretty much anybody could pick up that tool and do it. But if you have 4 people that, are all available, the person who's the most experienced with it in an actual emergency, they're probably going to take the lead, and rightfully so. Because at the end of the day, the fire service are trying to protect people's life and people's property. In business, we're trying to protect our assets and our customers. So why wouldn't you want to have the most experienced person there in order to execute? At the same time, you always got to want to be prepared and make sure that you have a backup so that people can step in and take over and execute, hopefully as efficiently as as your sort of primary contact. But making sure that you got a deep bench of that knowledge and how to use all of those different tools.
Well, it's interesting as you were talking there, because I was thinking of some instances in the past that I've been through where someone who is supposed to know these tools because of their hierarchical level, so to speak, have been assigned to be the head of, I'll say, the IT team or whatever.
Right.
And yet when it comes to testing, they're busy. They've got other things they need to do, and they keep delegating. What do you have to say about that? Do you just move that person out of that position because if something happens, they don't know what's going to go on? Or do you, confront them and say, look, no, you got to know this? How do you approach that?
I think it's the latter. There can be the more people you have to bring in order to execute some sort of a response, the more points of failure you're introducing into the equation. And the last thing we need in a disruption response are additional points of failure. So yeah, I think that's a conversation that you got to have with that leader. Listen, if it's not going to be that leader, if he's not going to be your assigned member of the emergency response team, then it's okay to make it somebody else, make it somebody who reports to them. Because we've also always had, leaders and managers who, are there to manage the overall process, but they may not be the expert in any one particular thing. And I think that that's okay. But you damn well better know. So if it's that one person who does know how to sort of pull those triggers and push the right buttons to execute a critical, tool within your toolbox and your emergency response, then it's probably better to bring that person in and make them the primary ERT contact, as opposed to now having to, add an additional member to your emergency response team. I think it's probably situation based, different circumstances may necessitate different things. But at the end of the day, you really should have hopefully one contact who does have the authority and the ability and the knowledge and the access in order to execute whatever they need to within their stated role on the emergency response team.
Yeah, I've seen situations where I call it the Mighty Mouse situation. Mighty Mouse used to sing that song, "Here I Come to Save the Day."
Yeah.
And the director or vice president who never participated suddenly becomes Mighty Mouse, tries to take over everything. Here I come to save the day, and just messes everything up because they don't know what's in the plans. They don't know who's involved. They don't know who they should be talking to. And you've got your normal situation. Well, it's not normal. Your current situation you're trying to deal with, and this Mighty Mouse character, vice president, has now created another internal confusion as well.
Yeah, I think I think the leaders and the heads of organizations, when it comes to emergency response, within your company, you got to put that ego aside. You really can't be worrying about people's silos, and where they, what they want to have control of and what they don't want to have control of. This isn't the time or place for that. You got to put that aside. If you're not going to be the expert, we're going to put the person in place who is going to be. It doesn't mean that they're going to lose their job. That's okay. They may be very fine generalists, right? General managers overseeing an organization. But let's say an operations manager, at least 25% of some percentage of their job, let's say 25%, should be about preparing for a disaster. And the more team members you got to wait on to bring in order to execute something, it's the longer that damage is perpetuating. Now, that doesn't mean that there could be circumstances in which, some tool, down the line a little bit, there are some things, I would suggest that as part of a business continuity plan, that just like we identify our critical functions and then our critical assets, right, and our business impact analysis that needs to be kept and maintained and kept up and running, we should also do the same thing with our emergency response tools and protocols. There are some that probably are more important to happen before others. For example, when we talk about communicate, I'll give you an example, communications. Different companies may have a different level. If you can only communicate to one group at a time, let's say your internal employees, your customers, and your leadership. Let's say those are 3 different groups that you would have to communicate to. You might have to stack rank them because you probably can't do all 3 at the same time. So the company needs to decide, well, who's the most important? Let's say they put their customers number 1, their employees second, and their leadership third. They might have 3 different tools to do those 3 different communications. Well, you should probably make sure that whoever is the primary member of the emergency response team knows how to execute and utilize the tools that are for your most important communication, right? So what did I say? That was customers, clients, and internal leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So your internal leadership tool, whatever that might be, maybe that's the one that you can sort of, put down on a lower level and maybe not have to worry so much about, that your ER team member knows how to execute on that, because that could delay a little bit. We could wait a couple hours. We can wait to bring on somebody, who's more familiar with that, wait to bring on that expert before, sending out that communication.
Well, I've got one final question for you. Firefighters spend a lot of time preparing for disasters, yet organizational leaders spend time on responding. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think this is probably where the analogy firefighters and business starts to fall apart a little bit. Because, honestly, a firefighter's primary job, right, emergency responder or first responder, that is their one job. That's their main job. That's their focus, is to respond to an emergency. Whereas an organizational leader, their focus should be on growing and running a business versus responding to emergencies. So I think the difference is really a focused one. Organizational leaders need to acknowledge that part of their job, and I mentioned this before, part of their job is to prepare for and respond to emergencies. And it's really up to them and their leadership to define just what percentage of their job should be focused on disruptions and preparing for them. Because, if a company spent all of its time preparing for emergencies and they don't have any time to do business, then they're not going to have a business to try and defend anymore. So we have to decide, well, just how much, what's the risk reward trade-off? How much time and money do we have, should we invest in this? I mean, I've read a couple articles, and I'm not sure where they got this number from, but it said that the average company spends 6% of its expenses are on business continuity planning, disaster recovery. I'm not sure where that number came from. I'm sure it varies greatly from company to company, depending on the nature of the business that they're in. But the idea that there was a percentage of effort and expense defined and aligned to planning and preparing, I think is an important one. I've always been a fan as a leader with my teams, I always ask them to, okay, tell me what you're working on and what percentage of your time, or maybe it's by hours, how many hours a week do you spend working on each one of these things? So I know what they're working and what they're doing, what they're working on and what they're doing. So I think if you're in an operational role or a member of the emergency response team, then that person should be aware, and it should be, set in the expectations, what percentage of their time they should be spending preparing for and responding to emergencies. Of course, that can vary a little bit over time, but I think it sort of sets that expectation. And that way you get that one manager who isn't really spending that much time preparing, when it comes to performance evaluation or review time, I would be looking at that person. Okay, 25% of your time should be spent on preparing for disruptions. What did you do? Where was that 25%? Oh, well, I spent it doing this and doing that. Okay, well, you're putting us at greater risk because you didn't spend the amount of time that you need to maintain it. That's part of maintaining the organization, making sure that it stays safe, stable, and resilient. So I think that's a big miss if you don't, clearly define, the leaders don't clearly define that role ahead of time.
I remember saying once a few years back that for leadership, business continuity or whatever wording they want to use should actually be a part of their performance incentives to make sure that they were part of either crisis management teams or they were taking the training necessary, rather than just giving directions and not really paying attention, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly right.
I doubt very many leaders would go for that, but still, if it's in my performance, it should be in others.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think it depends on it depends on the role. It depends on the role that you're in, and role that you're in. And this is an uphill battle for anybody in our industry. Trying to get leaders to see sort of kind of like behind the dollar signs, right? I mean, our thing that they're going to be focused most on is making money, right, and driving the business forward. And I understand that, but you got to worry about protecting that business as well. You have to worry about making sure that you have the right resources, the people and assets in place in order to defend what you've worked so hard to earn.
Right. Well, it's been great talking to you. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Do you have any final thoughts on either in general or specifically on the article, 4 things you can learn from firefighters? I'll give you a minute or two.
Sure. So I think it's, so when we talk about, firefighters and first responders, yes, they train and it's really about the training and preparation. And it can relate to business. It can take a lot of lessons as far as, being prepared for that emergency, responding quickly, empowering your employees, just like we talked to, the public about, don't be afraid to call 911. There are other lessons that can be learned too that I didn't put in the article because otherwise I'd come up with a list of 20. But, even, I hate to say it, but staying out of the way, let the professionals do their job. Let the emergency response team respond. Let them do their job. Stay out of their way. Don't distract them because they have a specific job that they need to do. The faster we can respond, within the first 10 minutes is probably of an emergency response is where the most damage is going to be done. It's no different for a business. So respond quickly, train up so you can have an effective response once you do, and empower your employees to you become aware of the response as quickly as possible. You want to reduce that 10-minute time frame, and the closer you can get to an immediate response and immediate action, then the less damage is going to be done to your company based on that unknown disruption.
Well, great. Thanks very much, Andrew. I really enjoyed the chat today.
Yeah,
and
same here.
It was nice kind of comparing something different rather than just a methodology. So it was nice to talk about firefighters and but bringing the two together and using one as the example for the other. And hopefully that helps some people out there somewhere in the world, understand things a little bit clearer. I enjoyed that, the analogies that you used and comparing firefighters, and giving us something to think about a little bit differently. I enjoyed that.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate it. And if anybody in the audience wants to reach out to me, I'm on LinkedIn, Andy Ziegler, Ziegler. I don't think I'm the only one, but it's probably not going to be too hard to find me. So I'm always happy to chat with people, especially those that are in the industry.
And if they can't, they can reach out to me and I'll set you up with them. I'll forward them to you that way. If by chance they have a problem. But thanks, Andy. I really appreciate your time and expertise today. And thanks for reaching out, because you were one of those people I always talk about at the beginning of the show. So thanks very much. I appreciate that.
All right. You're very welcome.
And to everybody watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.